Today's lecture in anatomy and physiology is brain and cranial nerves. The outline of this lecture consists of meninges of the brain surface anatomy and function, including the cerebrum, which contains the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, which contains the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Brain ventricles and cranial nerves will also be discussed. Now let's talk about the meninges. The meninges are the membranous coverings of the brain and spinal cord. The meninges consist of 3 layers. You have the dura mater, which are these 2 layers, but it's really just one because these are fused together. And the space between the dura and the skull is the epidural space because it's above the dura. The space between the dura and the arachnoid is the subdural space because it's below the dura. The arachnoid is the next layer, and the space between the arachnoid and the pia is the subarachnoid space because it's below the arachnoid. The deepest layer is the pia mater, and that's directly adherent to the brain, and that's this layer right here. Let's talk about brain surface anatomy. We have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. We also have the cerebellum and the brainstem. The brainstem consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. So these 3. Now let's look at the brain surface anatomy from different views. And as we've already discussed, the cerebrum contains the frontal, parietal, occipital lobes. And you can take time out for yourself to look at the different views. We also have the cerebellum. We have the brainstem, which is the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and we have different fissures and sulci. We have our central sulcus, which divides the brain into a left and a right half. We have the lateral sulcus, or lateral fissure, which is also known as the Sylvian fissure, which separates the temporal lobe from the rest of the brain. So like I said before, please take time to look at these different views of the brain and know the surface anatomy from each of these views. Let's talk a little more about the GYRI and the fissures. As I already mentioned, we have the central sulcus and we have the lateral sulcus, which is the Sylvian fissure. This is important. This is important because we have the precentral gyrus, which is here, and the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is anterior to the central sulcus, which is why it's called precentral. The postcentral gyrus is posterior to the central sulcus. The precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus is the primary sensory cortex. And this picture here, this is what is called a homunculus. This is your motor homunculus, your sensory homunculus. And this just indicates which parts of the brain, specifically the precentral gyrus, is allocated to which parts of the body. So as you notice, the face and the hands have a disproportionately large amount of area allotted to them. And this is because of the number of fine motor movements of the hand and the face, because there are lots of facial muscles and lots of muscles in the hands. So this has a proportionately larger area. The arm and the legs have a smaller area, even though they're bigger body parts, because those motor functions don't require as much finesse. Same for the sensory. The head and the hands have a disproportionately large amount of area allotted to them because of the density of sensory receptors in those areas. The finer the motor function, the finer the function of the sensory function, the more area you're going to have allocated to it. But anyway, please feel free to stop this video and take a closer look. Now let's talk about functional anatomy. So the frontal lobe, which is here, is responsible for cognition and behavioral control and motor function. You may have seen somebody who has a damaged frontal lobe and they act inappropriately. This is probably the reason why. Then we have and in addition to the cognitive and behavioral control, the frontal lobe also has motor function because the precentral gyrus is located in the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe has sensory function, and it contains the postcentral gyrus. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and memory. The occipital lobe is responsible for vision and contains the primary visual cortex. The brainstem contains the respiratory and cardiac control centers. The cerebellum is responsible for balance and equilibrium as well as coordination. It's basically responsible for you being able to walk straight without falling. So let's shift our attention to talking about the brain ventricles. There are 4 ventricles in the brain. You have these 2 lateral ventricles. You have the 3rd ventricle, and you have the 4th ventricle. The 3rd and 4th ventricle are connected by the cerebral aqueduct. Let's talk about CSF flow. So you have CSF, CSF is secreted by the choroid plexuses in each of the ventricles, whether it's lateral ventricles, 3rd ventricles, or even 4th ventricles. So you have CSF being secreted in the lateral ventricles, traveling through the interventricular foramina into the 3rd ventricle. Then this CSF travels through the cerebral aqueduct into the 4th ventricle, where it flows out of the 2 lateral apertures, and the median apertures fill in the subarachnoid space. And then these arachnoid villi, also called arachnoid granulations, reabsorb the CSF into the dural sinuses. Now let's talk about cranial nerves. The cranial nerves originate from the brainstem, and they're numbered according to what order they come off of on the brainstem, as you can see here, but they're named according to their function. So they're named according to what they do. As I already mentioned, there are 12 cranial nerves, and they have different functions. They can be sensory, motor, or both. Now let's look at the cranial nerves in a little more detail. And please refer to this diagram to help you learn the functions a little better. So we have cranial nerve 1, which is your olfactory nerve, which is responsible for smell. So cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is your optic nerve. That's responsible for vision. So number 2, your eye, optic nerve, vision. Cranial nerve 3, your oculomotor nerve. It provides motor to extraocular muscles of the eye, except for 2, which are the superior oblique and the lateral rectus. It also provides motor to the pupillary and ciliary muscles in the eye. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear muscle, which provides motor to the superior oblique muscle. And it's called trochlea because the superior oblique muscle actually hooks on to an apparatus in the orbit called the trochlea, which is why it's called the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 5 is a major one. It's a trigeminal nerve. It's responsible for all the sensation in your face. And it also provides motor to the muscles of mastication. So it's responsible for helping you chew your food. Cranial nerve 6 is the abducens, and it's the motor to lateral rectus muscle. So your abducens, because the lateral rectus muscle abducts the eye. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve, and the facial nerve is a major nerve which provides motor to the muscles of facial expression. That's why you can smile and frown. And it provides the sensation of taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So this also helps you taste your food. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibular-cochlear nerve. And it's formed by the vestibular nerve, which is responsible for balance and equilibrium, and the cochlear nerve, which is responsible for hearing. So its name kind of tells you what it does. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glosso is tongue, pharyngeal is pharynx. So it provides sensation to the soft palate, pharynx, larynx as part of the gag reflex. So your gag reflex is testing cranial nerve 9, which is a glossopharyngeal nerve. It provides taste to the posterior 2/3 of the tongue. And recall, the facial nerve provides taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So it's actually taste to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. That was a mistake on my part. And it innervates the stylopharyngeus muscle. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. So it provides autonomic, motor, and sensory to the thoracic and abdominal viscera via parasympathetic innervation. Cranial nerve 11 is the spinal accessory nerve, which provides motor to the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. So it helps you shrug your shoulders and turn and bend your neck. Cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve, which provides motor to the muscles of the tongue. Thank you. Like this video, subscribe.